Chapter 119. After all, the cub was a living creature and couldn't be placed in a spatial belt. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to survive. If they were to leave the cub outside, there was a high chance that they would meet people who knew their stuff. Once the news of the Golden Fur Tiger King's cub was leaked out, it would attract a lot of experts or powerful forces. With the Flame Mercenary Group's current strength, they simply didn't have the ability to deal with these matters. Moreover, the cub was a living creature and couldn't be placed in a spatial belt. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to survive. Once the cub was placed outside, there was a high chance that they would meet people who knew their stuff. Once the news of the Golden Fur Tiger King's cub was leaked out, it would definitely attract a lot of experts or powerful forces. With the Flame Mercenary Group's current strength, they simply didn't have the ability to deal with these matters. Haha, since you don't have the ability to bring this Golden Tiger King cub out, then you might as well just give it to us. Just at that moment, a burst of loud laughter suddenly rang out. The voice was filled with unconcealable excitement. Soon after, a figure flickered in the darkness and a large group of people suddenly appeared, quickly surrounding the Flame Mercenary Group. There were nearly 20 people in total, all of them wearing armor and helmets. Many of their armors were broken and had bloodstains on them. It was obvious at a glance that they had been through a battle. Seeing the sudden appearance of such a large group of people, the expressions of the Flame Mercenary Group immediately became ugly. However, when they saw the small insignia hanging on their chests, all of their expressions changed greatly. Captain Kendall's face was somewhat pale as he stared at these people and said in a low voice, "It's actually the Zhou Mercenary Group." His voice was somewhat trembling. "Haha, at least you have some insight to recognize us. If you know what's good for you, then immediately hand over the cub to us. Otherwise, you should know the consequences." The person who spoke seemed to be the leader. The leader indifferently swept his gaze over the Flame Mercenary Group, his eyes filled with disdain. Then, his gaze landed on the little cub that was eating the meat with relish in front of the bonfire. The excitement in his eyes was difficult to conceal. Not a single person from the Flame Mercenary Group spoke. Everyone's expression became incomparably serious. Xianxia's gaze swept over the armored members of the Zhou Mercenary Group. Just by sensing their auras, he already had a rough idea of the Zhou Mercenary Group's strength. Among them, aside from 2 Saint Masters, everyone else had the strength of a great saint. Moreover, even the 2 Saint Masters were a level higher than Captain Kendall, having reached the level of a mid-saint. Xianxia inwardly let out a sigh of relief. At least these people in front of him. As long as there weren't any Saint Masters, there wouldn't be any big problems. Ayo! Roar! At this moment, the little cub had already finished eating the meat in its mouth. Its small eyes stared at the even larger pieces of meat on the bonfire as it continuously cried out. It looked like it still wasn't full, completely unaware that danger had already descended upon it. Xianxia slowly squatted down and carefully held the little beast in his arms. Immediately, the gazes of the 20 or so people from the Zhou Mercenary Group all fell on Xianxia. Each and every one of them stared fiercely at him, filled with killing intent. "Brat, hurry up and give the cub to me. Otherwise, you'll die right now." The leader of the Zhou Mercenary Group yelled at Xianxia. Hearing this, Xianxia calmly stared at the person who spoke. Not only was he not angry at all, he even had a slight smile on his face as he calmly said, "I'm afraid that even if I give the cub to you, you still won't let us go. That's because you're afraid that we'll leak the news and bring you a completely avoidable trouble. Moreover, it'll be an extremely big trouble." The leader coldly laughed as he stared at Xianxia. He coldly said, "You're very smart, but sometimes the smarter a person is, the faster they'll die. Therefore, sometimes, people shouldn't be too smart. If they're stupid, they'll live a little longer." Following his words, a powerful saint force gathered in the leader's hand and quickly formed a long sword. The leader held the long sword in his hand and pointed it at Xianxia. He said in a deep voice, "Brat, I'll give you one last chance. Obediently hand over the cub. Otherwise, I swear that you'll die a very miserable death." As soon as the leader finished speaking, the other members of the Zhou Mercenary Group all drew their saint weapons. At the same time, their presences radiated from their bodies, pressing toward Jianshan. At the same time, the flame mercenary group did not back down either. They all took out their own saint weapons and vigilantly stared at the surrounding Zhou mercenary group. Every single one of them had an unprecedentedly solemn expression on their faces. They knew very well that even if they were to hand the infant over to the Zhou mercenary group, the Zhou mercenary group would not let them go. If they were in the same situation, they would also do the same. Since they were going to die no matter what, they might as well go all out. Even if they were to die, they would drag someone down with them. Even if they could not, they would not let the Zhou mercenary group off so easily. Seeing the reactions of the flame mercenaries, a sliver of disdain appeared in the eyes of the leader of the Zhou mercenary group. He then turned to Jianshan and said in a deep voice, "Brat, are you really not going to hand it over? If you hand over the cub, I can let you live." Now that the cub was in Jianshan's hands, the leader did not dare to act rashly before Jianshan released the cub. He was afraid that Jianshan would kill the Class 5 cub if he pressured him too much. Jianshan clearly understood the leader's concerns and could not help but chuckle. He held the squealing cub in his left hand and gently stroked the cub's furry head with his right hand. He smiled and said, "Since you want this cub so much, why don't you come and take it? Are you saying you don't have the guts to come and take it even though you have the guts to ask for it?" The leader stared at Jianshan with an extremely sharp gaze. He had a bad feeling about Jianshan's calm expression because Jianshan's demeanor was far too abnormal. He could not figure out what was going on. The leader tilted his head slightly and said to a mercenary beside him, "You, go and take the cub." The mercenary did not hesitate in the slightest. He immediately and carefully walked forward, attempting to snatch the cub from Jianshan's hands. When the mercenary arrived in front of Jianshan with a face full of vigilance, Jianshan did not make the slightest move. He still stood there with a smile on his face. Even so, the mercenary did not dare to relax in the slightest. He slowly extended his hand and carefully tried to grab the cub in Jianshan's hands. At the same time, the Zhou Mercenary Company's mercenaries also tightened their grip on the holy weapons in their hands as they stared at Jianshan. The leader also became nervous. Very quickly, the mercenary's hands successfully grabbed the cub. He did not care about the cub's fierce struggle as he slowly lifted it up. From the beginning to the end, the mercenary was very careful and was always on guard against Jianshan's sudden attack. However, Jianshan's gaze turned cold as a silver-white longsword suddenly appeared in his right hand. It then turned into a silver-white ray of light and pierced towards the mercenary's throat with lightning speed. Even though the mercenary had always been on guard against Jianshan, the speed of this sword was still too fast for him. The mercenary could only see a flash of silver-white light, and then he felt a pain in his throat, and in front of him, a silver-white longsword suddenly appeared. In the next moment, an intense feeling of suffocation came over him, and the mercenary didn't even have time to let out a scream before he fell to the ground. The fifth-level cub in his hand also fell to the ground from the air, crying out in pain. Jianshan's sword was really too fast. Even though the mercenary was always on guard against Jianshan's sudden attack, when Jianshan moved towards him, he was still unable to dodge the sword that had already surpassed his mental reaction. The leader of the Zhou Mercenary Company stared blankly at the mercenary whose throat was pierced by Jianshan's sword. His face was full of disbelief and his heart was filled with horror. Jianshan's sudden sword was so fast that even with his strength as a high-level Saint Master, he could only catch a vague shadow of the sword. He could not see it clearly at all. In a short moment, the leader came back to his senses and forcefully suppressed the shock in his heart. He immediately ordered, "Everyone attack. Kill without mercy. Be careful not to hurt the cub." After saying that, a huge sword appeared in the leader's hand. With powerful energy fluctuations, it whistled towards Jianshan with an ear-piercing sound. In the Zhou Mercenary Company, a huge sword also appeared in the hand of another Saint Master. He cooperated with the leader and swung his huge sword towards Jianshan. From Jianshan's sword, the two of them could see that Jianshan was not so easy to deal with. As a result, the only two Saint Masters in the Zhou Mercenary Company actually tacitly agreed to attack Jianshan at the same time. On the other side, The Flame Mercenary Company also clashed with the rest of the Zhou Mercenary Company. Both sides began an intense battle. The members of the Flame Mercenary Company did not scatter. Instead, they gathered together and formed a circle, protecting Xiao Dao's group of 3 who were only saints. This was because Xiao Dao's group of 3 who were only saints could not interfere in this kind of battle. They would only be sending themselves to their deaths. The other 5 great saints and Kendall, who was a low-level saint master, fought against the Zhou Mercenary Company outside the circle. However, due to the great difference in strength and numbers, the Flame Mercenary Company was at a complete disadvantage not long after the battle began. They were basically completely suppressed by the Zhou Mercenary Company and could only defend. Chapter 120. Xianxia didn't want to clash head-on with the Zhou Mercenary Group's leader. Instead, he leaned to the side and dodged the leader's large sword by a hair's breadth. At the same time, the light wind sword in his hand turned into a silver light and pierced towards the Zhou Mercenary Group's leader. Although Xianxia's battle prowess wasn't any weaker than a Saint Master's, that was only in terms of battle prowess. In terms of Saint Force, there was still a large gap between him and a Saint Master. If he were to clash head-on with the Zhou Mercenary Group's leader, then Xianxia would definitely be at a disadvantage. Without a doubt, that would be a very unwise choice. Xianxia's greatest advantage was his fast sword. It was so fast that people on the same level as him would never be able to react to it. Even if they were a level higher than him, they would only be able to vaguely catch a glimpse of the sword's shadow. Furthermore, Xianxia's movements were mysterious and unpredictable. Even if he were to meet someone who was stronger than him and had Wind Saint Force, he would still be able to contend with them for a bit. Against a Saint Master whose Saint Force wasn't much stronger than his own, unless it was absolutely necessary, Xianxia wouldn't use his weakness to clash head-on with his opponent's strength. Seeing that Xianxia's sword was coming towards his throat at an unimaginable speed, the leader's face instantly became incomparably solemn. Immediately after, a large amount of Saint Force surged out from his body. As for himself, he relied on his Saint Force to suddenly rotate his body and move to the side, narrowly dodging Xianxia's fatal strike. Even though the speed of Xianxia's sword was very fast, it was still not enough to force the high-level Saint Master leader into a corner. Even so, the light wind sword still managed to leave a shallow white mark on the leader's shoulder armor. With a flick of his wrist, the light wind sword seemed to have transformed into a nimble little snake. The sharp edge of the sword cut through the air, and with a sweep of the sword, it chased after the leader who was trying to dodge to the side without letting up. The leader's expression became unprecedentedly solemn. Although he could feel that Xianxia's strength wasn't as high as his own, the speed of the sword was so fast that even with his current strength, he would only be able to dodge it if he used all of his strength. Furthermore, the sword was aimed at his throat, so if he wasn't careful, he could lose his life at any time. Without the slightest hesitation, the leader raised his great sword in front of his throat. Just as he was about to block, the light wind sword's sharp edge had already clashed with his great sword, creating a fierce friction. Although the light wind sword didn't pierce the leader's body, the sharp and powerful sword chi coming from the light wind sword was enough to shock the leader. He secretly thought to himself, "What a sharp sword chi! What kind of technique does this brat practice? Could it be that he uses a battle skill?" Thinking about a battle skill, the leader's heart couldn't help but burn with passion. He couldn't help but think about how to deal with Xianxia and steal his battle skill. In the Tianyuan continent, battle skills were extremely precious, far more precious than cultivation techniques. Even the Zhou Mercenary Group, which was one of the strongest mercenaries in Wake City, didn't have any battle skills, including their leader who was a great Saint Master. However, just as the leader was distracted, a strong sense of danger suddenly came over him. He saw a silver-white ray of light expanding in front of his eyes. It was so fast that it was actually 2 to 3 times faster than the previous 2 times. In a short instant, the silver-white ray of light avoided the huge sword that was still blocking in front of the leader and reached his throat. Through this thin ray of light, one could vaguely see the blurry tip of a sharp sword hidden in it. The leader was horrified. When he reacted, The sword tip that was wrapped in a hazy layer of sword radiance was less than a foot from his throat. Under such a close distance, when faced with this sword that was as fast as lightning, even if the leader had high-level sacred expert strength, he still couldn't evade in time. Just as the light wind sword was about to pierce through the leader's throat, another great sword suddenly cut through the air, bringing with it a piercing sound as it came from the side. Finally, a ding. With a ding sound, the great sword fiercely struck the light wind sword from the side. The light wind sword, which was originally going for the leader's throat, suddenly changed its trajectory and slid past the leader's throat. The person who suddenly made a move was the second person in the Zhou mercenary group who had the strength of a Saint Master. After slashing apart Jianxin's light wind sword, the person didn't stop at all and once again attacked Jianxin fiercely. At the same time, he shouted at the leader, "Cass, you actually dared to be distracted at a time like this. You bastard, do you want to die?" Hearing these words, the leader didn't seem to be angry at all. He extended his hand to touch his neck. His face that was hidden behind the helmet instantly turned pale. His forehead was also covered with a layer of fine sweat, because he could clearly feel that the leather armor around his neck had already cracked open. If it wasn't for the timely assistance of others, his neck wouldn't be as simple as just a crack on the leather armor. At this time, Jianxin had already exchanged a few blows with the second Saint Master. This person was only a mid-Saint Master and was slightly weaker than the leader of the Zhou mercenary group. In just a few short exchanges, he had already been forced back by Jianxin's lightning-fast attacks. "Cass, what are you standing there for? Why aren't you helping? This brat sword is too fast. I can't block it anymore. Damn it, why is his speed so abnormal?" Seeing the leader standing there in a daze, the mercenary who was fighting with Jianxin angrily cursed. It was obvious that facing Jianxin's torrential rain of attacks, it was already very difficult for him to block. The armor that covered his body already had many white marks on it. If it wasn't for the fact that the armor's defense was very strong, he would have been injured in many places already. There was no way he could still maintain his good condition. Hearing this, the leader's eyes narrowed. Holding the great sword in his right hand, he suddenly released a strong wave of Saint Qi. Then he raised the great sword up high and chopped down at Jianxin. Following the fall of the great sword, a sword Qi shot out at an extremely fast speed towards Jianxin. Jianxin glanced over and moved slightly, easily dodging the incoming sword Qi. The sword Qi struck a tree behind him with a boom. A hole that was around a meter in diameter had been punched through the thick tree. At this time, two ear-piercing sounds could be heard. The two Saint Masters from the Zhou mercenary group had already attacked at the same time. Their great swords carried a strong wave of Saint Qi as they cut through the air. Jianxin's eyes flashed with a sharp light. Facing the two great swords, he didn't even try to dodge. Instead, the light wind sword's hazy glow became even denser. Then, it turned into a sky full of afterimages that collided with the two great swords in midair. Ding ding ding! The sound of metal colliding rang out. In an instant, Jianxin had already stabbed out 18 times at an extremely fast speed. Every time he stabbed out, he would accurately hit the two great swords. The 18 swords pierced out, forcefully blocking the two swords. Furthermore, every time the swords collided with the light wind sword, a powerful force would be transmitted from the light wind sword, causing the two men's arms to tremble violently. When the power of the 18 swords converged together, it formed a powerful force that could not be ignored. The strong rebounding force had already caused the two men's arms to become completely numb, and their right hands that were holding onto the light wind sword had already ruptured. Feeling the numbness in their right arms, the two men looked at each other in shock. At this moment, they both felt the urge to retreat. After this exchange, the two men were very clear that although Jianxin's strength was not as good as theirs, the terrifying strength that he displayed was something that even if the two of them worked together, it would still be very difficult for them to block. Especially that lightning-fast sword, they had to be extremely vigilant in order to guard against it. If they weren't careful, they would lose their lives. If this continued, they were afraid that both of them would die here today. "Captain Casa, the baby beast is in our hands." When they heard this, Those two individuals with sacred expert strength turned around, only to see a mercenary whose entire body was wrapped in a layer of armor currently holding a young beast. Meanwhile, the young beast was continuously struggling in his hands, its 4 claws waving about randomly in the air, releasing tender cries from its mouth. At the same time, it was cute but also a bit pitiful. Seeing this, the two men's eyes revealed a trace of joy. However, at this moment, a silver longsword pierced towards the leader's throat at an extremely fast speed. This time, by the time the leader sensed it, it was already too late for him to take any defensive measures. The other Saint Master level mercenary was also too late to save him. The sharp sword tip pierced through the leather protection of the leader's throat and pierced deeply into his throat. Casa! The other mercenary also came back to his senses. However, when he saw the leader's throat being pierced, his eyes immediately became bloodshot. He roared out angrily and powerful saint force gathered on his huge sword. He swung it towards Xianxia. Xianxia didn't even look at him. He stomped on the ground and shot towards the mercenary holding the baby beast like a cannonball. Seeing the person who killed Captain Casa, who was a high-level saint, charging towards him, the mercenary's face changed greatly. He didn't believe he could stop an expert who could easily kill a high-level saint master. However, the mercenary was clearly not stupid. He immediately threw the baby beast in his hand. The direction he threw it was towards the remaining saint master fighting with Xianxia. Captain Claus catch? The baby beast was thrown high into the air. It drew a perfect arc in the air and accurately landed in the arms of the Saint Master mercenary. Looking at the Class 5 baby beast that was less than a foot long in his arms, the mercenary called Captain Claus quickly calmed down from his furious state. He didn't hesitate at all and immediately shouted, "Everyone, retreat immediately." Chapter 121. As soon as the roar ended, the originally quiet magical beast mountain range suddenly became lively. Countless sleeping magical beasts were awakened, and all kinds of roars came from all directions. All the roars of the magical beasts were filled with fear. None of the magical beasts dared to provoke the roar of the tiger. Hearing the tiger's roar, Xianxia's expression slightly changed, and he immediately became very serious. "Damn, that's the Golden Fur Tiger King's voice." Xianxia's voice was filled with unprecedented seriousness. The Golden-Furred Tiger King was a Class 5 magical beast. Magical beasts were the same as humans. There was an insurmountable gap between Class 4 and Class 5, and it was also a divide in strength. Once they crossed this gap, they would undergo a metamorphosis. From then on, they would enter a whole new world. The strength of a Class 5 magical beast and a Class 4 magical beast were two completely different worlds. With Xianxia's current strength, he couldn't even deal with a Class 4 magical beast, let alone a Class 5 magical beast that had entered a whole new world. "Not good," that's the Golden Fur Tiger King's voice. "Quickly, quickly, everyone leave this place, otherwise we will all lose our lives." Captain Klaus of the Zhou mercenary group cried out in alarm. His voice was trembling, but before he could finish his words, he carried the Golden Fur Tiger King's cub and ran out of the forest as fast as he could. Behind him, the other members of the Zhou mercenary group who were fighting with the Raging Flame mercenary group also abandoned their opponents and ran out of the forest with Klaus. However, just as Klaus was running a few steps with the cub, Xianxia's figure appeared in front of him like a ghost. The silvery white light wind sword turned into a blur as it pierced towards Klaus' throat like lightning. In this dangerous moment, Xianxia didn't plan on letting him go. Klaus' expression slightly changed, and he immediately brandished his great sword to clash with Xianxia's light wind sword. At the same time, he angrily cursed, "You madman, now that the 5th-rank Golden Fur Tiger King is coming, you actually dare to stop me? If you don't run now, it'll be too late for you." Xianxia was indifferent, as if he didn't hear Klaus' words at all. The light wind sword turned into a silvery white light as it continued to pierce towards Klaus. Klaus raised his sword to block, and after a few rounds, Xianxia's sword pierced through Klaus' left shoulder. At the same time, Xianxia's left hand reached out to grab the cub that was in Klaus' arms. Klaus endured the pain from his left shoulder and immediately retreated, dodging Genshin's hand that was about to grab the cub. At the same time, he shouted, "Everyone attack together and stop him. This cub is too important to our Zhou mercenary group, we can't lose it." Hearing this, the Zhou mercenary group's mercenaries had a trace of hesitation in their eyes. However, there were still a few that didn't disobey Klaus' orders. 5 of them immediately rushed out with their holy weapons and launched a fierce attack on Genshin, firmly holding him back. Klaus quickly rushed out of the forest with the cub. There were still a few mercenaries that didn't want to wait for their deaths, so they followed behind Klaus and escaped into the forest. These great saint-level mercenaries naturally couldn't pose any threat to Genshin. By the time Genshin finished off the 5 mercenaries, Klaus had already led the rest of the mercenaries away. Roar! The tiger's roar in the distance grew closer and closer. The Class 5 golden-haired Tiger King was rapidly approaching. A trace of anxiety also appeared in Genshin's eyes. He quickly arrived in front of Captain Kendall and said, "The golden-haired Tiger King is rapidly approaching. It'll reach our current location soon. Captain Kendall, we can't stay here for long. We need to leave quickly." Captain Kendall and the other members of the Flame Mercenary Group were currently bathed in blood and covered in countless wounds of various sizes. Fortunately, the battle hadn't lasted for long. Otherwise, the Flame Mercenary Group would have suffered some losses. Everyone quickly leave this place. There was no time to treat the wounds on their bodies that were still bleeding. Everyone immediately ran as fast as they could towards the outskirts of the forest. However, due to everyone's injuries, their speed wasn't very fast. Roar! Another angry roar was heard. This time, the roar was even closer. Everyone could faintly hear the sound of the golden-haired Tiger King running at high speed in the forest. The wind pressure it brought along was so strong that it made the leaves around it rustle with a hua-hua-hua sound. Everyone in the Flame Mercenary Group paled. Captain Kendall quickly ran as he looked behind him. He immediately took off his space belt and stuffed it into Genshin's hands. He said, "Genshin, you're the strongest among us. Only you have the greatest chance of escaping. I'll give this space belt to you right now. You have to successfully escape with it." Looking at the space belt that Captain Kendall had forcefully stuffed into his hands, Genshin was just about to refuse when Captain Kendall spoke again. "Genshin, don't refuse. If we can't leave this forest alive, then we'll have to trouble you to take care of our families. If we all die here, then their lives will become incomparably difficult. My parents, my wife, and one of my children. Whether or not they can live a good life in the future will all depend on you." Captain Kendall's tone actually carried a few traces of pleading. Looking at Captain Kendall with a complicated gaze, Genshin nodded with a heavy expression. He took the space belt from Captain Kendall and tightly grasped it. He comforted, "Uncle Kendall, we'll definitely be able to escape. That golden-haired Tiger King's target might not necessarily be us. Ah, save me." Suddenly, a cry for help rang out from behind. "Kabutus, it's Kabutus." He fell into the swamp. "Quick, Kabutus, grab my hand." The one who spoke was Xiao Dao. His voice was filled with anxiety. Hearing this, everyone immediately stopped. Genshin flashed and arrived in front of Xiao Dao, who was at the back of the group. He saw Xiao Dao lying on the ground in pain. His right arm was completely extended into the swamp beside him. Kabuto's figure had already disappeared from the group. Genshin's expression slightly changed. He immediately laid on the ground and his right hand followed Xiao Dao's position and inserted it into the swamp. However, he only managed to grab Xiao Dao's empty hand that was placed in the swamp. "Kabutus." Xiao Dao painfully closed his eyes. His voice was filled with sorrow. "Sigh." Genshin inwardly sighed. He immediately slung Xiao Dao over his shoulder and shouted, "Let's go." Saying so, he took the lead and ran forward. The other members of the Raging Flame Mercenary Group also inwardly sighed. Their eyes flashed with grief. They didn't hesitate in the slightest and once again ran towards the outskirts of the forest. At this moment, every bit of time they wasted was a little less hope of escaping. Because it was night, the magical Beast Mountain range was very dark. The visibility was very low, and even the road couldn't be seen. Along the way, everyone tripped and fell quite a few times. However, as soon as they fell, they would immediately get up and run again. While running, they would do their best to step on the roots of the trees to prevent themselves from falling into the swamp. Not long after they started running, Xianxia, who was leading the way, suddenly stopped. "Xianxia, why did you stop? Hurry up and run." Behind him, Captain Kendall anxiously said. Xianxia didn't say anything and only pointed forward. Seeing this, Captain Kendall raised his head and looked over. In the dark night, he could vaguely make out a dozen or so figures stopping in front of them. Their figures appeared to be in a sorry state, and all of them were panting heavily. "It's the Zhou mercenary group," Xianxia said. Hearing this, a stern look flashed through Captain Kendall's eyes. He said in a deep voice, "It's them. Why aren't they running? What are they standing there for? We can't escape. The path ahead has been blocked by a Class 4 magical beast. Why would a Class 4 magical beast appear here? Come, follow me. We'll go around from the side." Saying so, Xianxia immediately dove into the forest to the side. Another tiger's roar came from behind. This time, the sound was even closer. The roar was so loud that it temporarily blinded everyone in the Inferno mercenary group. After the roar passed, they saw a huge black shadow shooting out from behind at an extremely fast speed, pouncing towards the Zhou mercenary group in front. Soon after, they heard a series of miserable cries. In just a short exchange, several members of the Zhou mercenary group had fallen to the ground. There was even one person who was bitten by the huge black shadow and lifted high into the air. Not good, the Golden Tiger King's speed is too fast. It actually rushed over here so quickly. Let's go quickly, or else we won't have another chance. Looking at the black shadow, Xianxia instantly guessed the movement technique of the black shadow from its body shape. He immediately cried out in alarm. Soon after, Xianxia didn't hesitate and immediately dove into the dense forest to the side. Up ahead, the dozen or so people of the Zhou mercenary group only lasted for less than a breath of time before dying one by one at the hands of the Golden Tiger King. Only Klaus, who was holding the cub of the Golden Tiger King, luckily managed to survive. Against a genuine Class 5 Golden Tiger King, these mercenaries who were only great saints were naturally unable to withstand a single blow. Klaus held the Tiger King's right hand with his left hand while his right hand held a huge sword to the cub's throat. He was in a deadlock with the Golden Tiger King. The Golden Tiger King's body was 4 meters long and as tall as a person. Only a pitch-black shadow could be seen in the night, and it was impossible to see its full appearance. Roar! The Golden Tiger King let out a low roar. Its eyes had already become scarlet red as it stared at Klaus with an ominous glint in its eyes. It clearly didn't dare to act rashly in consideration of the child in Klaus' hands. Having reached Class 5, it already possessed a certain level of intelligence. Back off, immediately back off, or I'll kill it with a single strike. Klaus stared at the Golden Tiger King in front of him in fear. His entire body trembled as he roared out. "Ayo, ayo, oh ayo." The cub of the Golden Tiger King uneasily struggled in Klaus' hands. It clearly felt a little scared. Although it was a Class 5 Xiantian magical beast, it was still young and didn't possess the slightest bit of ability. Seeing that the Golden Tiger King was still unmoved, Klaus gritted his teeth and suddenly pressed the huge sword in his right hand down a little. Immediately, a few strands of golden fur slowly floated down. Roar! The Golden Tiger King let out a low roar and its huge body immediately retreated slowly. However, the scarlet-red ominous glint in its eyes became even more intense. Chapter 122. Seeing that the Golden Tiger King had retreated, Klaus couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. At this moment, his heart was beating so fast that even if someone was standing next to him, they would be able to hear it clearly. This time, he used the Golden Tiger King's cub to threaten the adult Golden Tiger King. It could be said that Klaus had taken a huge risk. He was forced to the end of the road, and this was his last gamble. Fortunately, he succeeded. However, the situation wasn't very optimistic. Although the Golden Tiger King was threatened by his cub, it was still eyeing him covetously. Klaus knew that it was impossible to make it retreat. Moreover, he didn't dare to force it too much. Otherwise, it would have the opposite effect. From the crimson light in the Golden Tiger King's eyes, the experienced Klaus knew that the Golden Tiger King had already sunk into a violent rage. It was only because its infant was still in his hands that it didn't dare to act out. Right now, the infant in his hands had completely become Klaus' protective talisman. If he lost this talisman, Klaus knew exactly what would happen to him. Under the threat of death, Klaus surprisingly calmed down. He quickly thought of a way to escape. Even though he was already in such a dangerous situation, Klaus still didn't give up on his desire to live. As long as there was a sliver of hope, he wouldn't give up. It was much better than standing there and waiting for death. Perhaps he really could escape from this seemingly weak sliver of hope. At this moment, Klaus caught sight of the flame mercenaries standing nearby from the corner of his eye. His heart skipped a beat, and he immediately tossed the infant beast in his hand high into the air, throwing it towards the flame mercenaries. Roar! Just as Klaus moved, the Golden Fur Tiger King, who was eyeing him covetously from the side, let out a deep roar. It immediately pounced forward and pushed Klaus to the ground. Its two front claws pressed down on Klaus' shoulders. Those sharp claws scratched out two deep bloody scars on Klaus' shoulders. The stench from the Golden Fur Tiger King's bloody mouth almost suffocated Klaus. Klaus' face instantly paled after being pressed to the ground by the Golden Tiger King. His mind was completely blank. He originally wanted to throw the cub over the flame mercenaries to draw the Golden Tiger King's attention away, but he didn't expect the Golden Tiger King to move so quickly. The moment he threw the cub out, the Golden Tiger King had already pushed him to the ground. Klaus was certain that he had no chance of survival. Oh! The infant tossed by Klaus continuously flipped in the air. The feeling of weightlessness finally caused the infant to feel a wave of fear, and it let out a frightened cry. Seeing the infant tossed into the air and falling to the ground, a trace of panic appeared in the Golden Tiger King's scarlet eyes in a very human-like manner. It let out a low roar and didn't have time to pay attention to Klaus under its claws. It leapt forward and chased after the infant. Klaus blanked out for a moment when he felt the weight on his shoulder lighten. When he saw the Golden Tiger King chasing after the infant, he immediately understood. A trace of ecstasy appeared in his eyes, and he ignored the intense pain from the Golden Tiger King's claws on his shoulder. He crawled up from the ground in a sorry state and directly disappeared into the dense forest beside him. Seeing Klaus escape, the tiger-type magical beast blocking the path ahead stomped its front paws uneasily on the ground. It wanted to immediately give chase, but when its gaze fell on the exposed Golden Tiger King, it immediately suppressed the impulse in its heart. Although a tiger-type magical beast already possessed a bit of intelligence, it was still too stupid in the end. How could it compare to a mature human when it came to thinking? The Golden Tiger King had only ordered it to block the path of the group, but hadn't ordered it to chase after the escapees. Before receiving the order from the Golden Tiger King, this simple-minded tiger-type magical beast could only watch as Klaus escaped before its eyes. Even if it wanted to give chase, it didn't dare. Just as Captain Kendall was about to enter the forest beside him, suddenly, a black object flew towards him. In the end, it directly hit his broad chest and fell to the ground. Seeing this, Captain Kendall subconsciously reached out his hand to catch the falling object. Just as his hand touched the black object, he instantly understood what it was. Captain Kendall's face turned pale in an instant. He secretly exclaimed in his heart, "Shit, this is actually the cub of the Golden Tiger King." At this moment, the cub of the Golden Tiger King was no longer a valuable treasure, but a hot iron. Whoever touched it would be very unlucky. Just as Captain Kendall was about to throw the cub away, a whistling sound suddenly rang out. Afterwards, a black silhouette appeared in front of Captain Kendall with extreme speed. A bloody mouth filled with a disgusting stench directly bit down on Captain Kendall's head. Captain Kendall didn't have time to react at all. His entire upper body was bitten by the Golden Tiger King that had suddenly appeared. The Golden Tiger King's sharp teeth pierced deeply into Captain Kendall's body. Bright red blood spurted out like a fountain from Captain Kendall's body. Captain Kendall let out a miserable cry. His voice was filled with pain and desolation. When Captain Kendall's miserable cry left the Golden Tiger King's mouth, it was clearly much weaker. "Captain Kendall! Uncle Kendall!" Seeing Captain Kendall's upper body being bitten by the Golden Tiger King, everyone in the Flame Mercenaries felt like their eyes were about to pop out of their sockets. They all let out heart-wrenching cries of pain. The heart-wrenching cries of the Flame Mercenaries entered the ears of Jianchen, who had just entered the forest. Jianchen's expression suddenly changed, and he immediately retreated from the forest. When Jianchen saw that Captain Kendall's upper body had been bitten by the Golden Tiger King, he turned pale with fright. Immediately after, he let out a cry of alarm. The silvery white light wind sword instantly appeared in his right hand. Suddenly, a powerful silvery white sword aura erupted from it, enveloping the entire light wind sword. So, the light wind sword left Jianchen's hand, as if it had transformed into an extremely intelligent immortal sword. It automatically flew out from Jianchen's hand and shot towards the Golden Tiger King's head with lightning speed. When the light wind sword aura pierced the Golden Tiger King's head, it only pierced through a layer of skin. It didn't cause any serious damage to the Golden Tiger King. Although Jianchen's attack with the Divine Sword technique was several times stronger, the Golden Tiger King was still a Class 5 magical beast. With Jianchen's strength being only at the intermediate Great Saint realm, being able to injure it was already an inconceivable matter. Roar! The pain from its head caused the Golden Tiger King to go berserk. Its scarlet eyes fiercely stared at Jianchen. Immediately after, it let out a low roar and used force in its mouth, directly biting Captain Kendall's upper body in two. The upper body was directly swallowed into its stomach. Immediately, a headless corpse with only the chest remaining was left. Bright red blood spurted out and quickly gathered into a pool of blood. "Uncle Kendall!" Seeing only the lower half of Captain Kendall's body remaining, the members of the Raging Flame mercenary group cried out in grief. Their eyes were filled with grief. Roar! The Golden Tiger King angrily roared as it leapt forward at an extremely fast speed towards Jianchen. Jianchen's feet moved mysteriously as his body moved like a ghost to the side, dodging the Golden Tiger King's attack. At the same time, the light wind sword that was hovering in the air turned into a silver light and once again shot towards the Golden Tiger King's head. But just as the light wind sword was about to pierce the Golden Tiger King's body, the Golden Tiger King's long tail suddenly turned into a phantom and heavily struck the light wind sword. Clang! The light wind sword was struck by the Golden Tiger King's tail with an unimaginable amount of strength. The light wind sword let out a crisp sound as it was sent flying more than 10 meters away. The powerful and sharp sword aura on the light wind sword also disappeared in an instant, returning it to its original appearance. Jianchen's body suddenly trembled as his face turned pale white. A trace of blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. The light wind sword was his saint weapon and was also under the control of his god. No matter how heavy the light wind sword's injuries were, it would still affect both his body and his god. Although the Golden Tiger King's tail didn't hit Jianchen's body, it had clearly exceeded the limits of the light wind sword's ability to withstand, causing Jianchen to suffer a heavy injury. The Golden Tiger King's body turned into a blur as it charged towards Jianchen with a speed that the naked eye couldn't follow. Its pair of sharp claws turned into a blur as it tried to grab Jianchen's chest. Jianchen hastily tried to dodge, but because the Golden Tiger King's speed was much faster than before, and because his body had suffered a heavy injury, he couldn't completely dodge the Golden Tiger King's attack. The Golden Tiger King's sharp claws ruthlessly swept across Jianchen's chest, immediately turning Jianchen's chest into a bloody mess. Even his white ribs were exposed. Jianchen let out a muffled groan as the intense pain caused his face to turn as white as a sheet of paper. In front of the Golden Tiger King, Jianchen didn't have the ability to resist at all. Even with the Divine Sword technique that he was so proud of, he only managed to leave a shallow wound on the Golden Tiger King's head. Chapter 123. Jianchen Run. I'll stop him. Suddenly, Xiao Dao roared out and arrived behind the Tiger King with his dagger. He raised his dagger and viciously slashed at the Tiger King's body. However, how could Xiao Dao, who only had the strength of a saint, injure the body of a Class 5 Golden Tiger King? When Xiao Dao's dagger came in contact with the Tiger King's body, it actually failed to leave a single mark. The Tiger King's tail turned into a blur once again as it whipped towards Xiao Dao at a speed that was difficult to discern with the naked eye. Slap. With a crisp sound, the Golden Tiger King's tail landed solidly on Xiao Dao's chest. The clothes on his chest were instantly torn apart, and his entire chest was deeply caved in. The inconceivably powerful force of the tiger's tail directly shattered the bones in Xiao Dao's chest, and the remaining force entered his body, shattering his internal organs. Xiao Dao spat out a mouthful of blood mixed with the powder of his internal organs. Xiao Dao's body flew backward for a distance of over 10 meters before crashing into a large tree and falling to the ground. Xiao Dao! Jianshan's face suddenly changed when he saw Xiao Dao's miserable state. He could not help but cry out. However, just when he wanted to go over and check on Xiao Dao's injuries, the Tiger King arrived before him with lightning speed. It opened its mouth and bit towards Jianshan's head mercilessly. The thick smell of blood from its mouth made it extremely difficult for Jianshan to breathe. In that split second, Jianshan twisted his head to the side as hard as he could, narrowly dodging the attack. At the same time, he ignored the intense pain in his chest and rolled away from the Tiger King. Jianshan basically had no power to fight back against the Tiger King. Even the technique he was so proud of was unable to pose a threat to the Tiger King. After all, the difference in strength between the two of them was just too great. Hurry up and leave. I'll keep the Golden Tiger King busy. After dodging, Jianshan immediately called out to the Flame Mercenaries. The members of the Flame Mercenaries were all stunned by Jianshan's words, but none of them moved. They were still quite far from the outskirts of the magical Beast Mountain range. With their speed, how could they escape the pursuit of a Class 5 magical beast? No, Jianshan, I'm afraid that you are the only one among us who has a chance of escaping. I'll hold the Golden Tiger King back. You run, and remember to avenge us in the future. Hoopa suddenly roared. He raised his sacred weapon and charged towards the golden-haired Tiger King without fear of death. At the same time, he roared, "We can't shake off the pursuit of a Class 5 magical beast at all. There's no hope of escaping today. Everyone attack together. Delay the golden-haired Tiger King and cover Jianshan as he leaves." Despair filled the eyes of the members of the Flame Mercenaries as they watched Hoopa charge towards the golden-haired Tiger King without fear of death. Hoopa's right. We're going to die today anyway. Since that's the case, why don't we sacrifice ourselves and cover Jianshan's escape? Everyone, attack together and delay the golden-haired Tiger King. Chang Ningfeng followed Hoopa's words and loudly called out. With that, he charged towards the golden-haired Tiger King with his huge sword in hand. Jianshan, remember to avenge us in the future. The other members of the Flame Mercenaries seemed to have been influenced by Hoopa and Chang Ningfeng's words and actions. They all charged towards the golden-haired Tiger King with their sacred weapons in hand, prepared to die for sure. Seeing the members of the Flame Mercenaries charging towards the golden-haired Tiger King without fear of death, Jianshan was stunned for a moment. Then he suddenly roared, "No, you guys hurry up and leave. I can still delay the golden-haired Tiger King for a while." With that, Jianshan instantly connected with the light wind sword that had fallen to the ground in the distance. The light wind sword once again emitted a sharp sword chi as it slowly rose into the air. However, compared to before, it was clear that the sword chi emitted by the light wind sword was much weaker. Although the members of the Flame Mercenaries all saw the strangeness of the light wind sword, at this moment, no one cared about it. Jianshan, hurry up and leave. Don't let our sacrifice go to waste. Seeing that Jianshan was about to make a move, Chang Ningfeng once again called out. The golden-haired Tiger King's scarlet eyes were filled with disdain as it looked at the members of the Flame Mercenaries charging towards it. At this time, it actually didn't make the first move. Hoopa was the first to arrive in front of the golden-haired Tiger King. With a loud roar, he poured all of his saint force into the axe in his hand and viciously chopped down on the golden-haired Tiger King's body. However, when Hu Po's seemingly powerful attack landed on the golden-haired Tiger King's body, it only managed to cut off a few strands of the golden-haired Tiger King's fur. With his strength as a great saint, his full-strength attack was unable to cause any harm to a Class 5 magical beast. Afterwards, the attacks of the members of the Flame Mercenaries also landed on the golden-haired Tiger King's huge body. However, without exception, aside from cutting off a few strands of fur, they didn't cause any harm to the golden-haired Tiger King. Its huge body didn't even move in the slightest. The members of the Flame Mercenaries were ashen. Although they already knew that Class 5 magical beasts were extremely powerful, only now did they truly understand just how powerful they were. The golden-haired Tiger King did not have a great advantage in terms of defense, but even so, the members of the Flame Mercenaries were helpless against it. Roar! The golden fur Tiger King let out a low roar and waved its front paw. Yu Xian, who was the weakest among them, had his chest ripped open and his heart shattered. At the same time, the golden-haired Tiger King's tail turned into a blur as it viciously struck Zhou Dekai. Slap! With a crisp sound, Zhou Dekai's entire body was sent flying far away by the tiger's tail. The bones in his chest were completely shattered, and the powerful force instantly crushed his internal organs. "Brother!" Zhou Shaokai cried out in grief and indignation before furiously glaring at the golden-haired Tiger King. With a roar, he raised his huge sword in both hands and swung it at the golden-haired Tiger King. However, Zhou Shaokai's attack was only a tickle to the golden-haired Tiger King. It was unable to injure it at all. The golden-haired Tiger King only used the most ordinary claw and bite attacks against the members of the Flame Mercenaries. Even so, it was not something that the Flame Mercenaries could withstand. In just a short moment, 3 people had been killed by a single strike from the golden-haired Tiger King. Now, only 5 people remained, bitterly holding on. "Jianchen, hurry up and leave. Don't let our sacrifice go to waste," Chang Ningfeng roared when he saw that Jianchen still hadn't left. "Jianchen, what are you still standing there for? Hurry up and leave. Remember to avenge us once you're strong enough. Kill this golden-haired Tiger King and take its monster core," Hu Po also shouted. Hu Po also shouted loudly. However, just as he finished speaking, the golden Tiger King's bloody mouth bit down on Hu Po's upper body. Then, with a forceful bite, Hu Po's burly body was instantly split into 2. His upper body was directly swallowed by the golden Tiger King. Seeing Hu Po die, Jianchen's entire body trembled. His eyes were filled with grief as he swept his gaze over the remaining members of the Flame Mercenaries. In the end, he clenched his teeth and controlled the light wind sword to fly back into his hand before immediately disappearing into the forest. In his heart, he was clear that even if he stayed behind, he wouldn't be able to change anything. In the end, only death would await him. After all, he was facing an incomparably powerful magical beast of the 5th step. However, the fact that the members of the Flame Mercenaries had used their own lives to delay the golden-haired Tiger King in order to buy him time to escape was a huge blow to Jianchen's heart. After entering the forest, Jianchen forced himself to ignore the miserable cries behind him. After determining the direction, he used his fastest speed to escape. There were a lot of weeds in the forest. Weeds that were half a person's height could be seen everywhere. There were even weeds that were as tall as a person. Jianchen endured the intense pain in his chest and used his movement technique to fly out of the forest. Not only was he faster this way, but he could also avoid the swamps that were everywhere on the ground. Roar! Less than 10 breaths of time after Jianchen had escaped, a whistling sound came from behind him. From the sound of it, he could tell that it was rapidly approaching him. Jianchen's face abruptly changed. He knew that the golden-haired Tiger King had probably already dealt with the members of the Flame Mercenaries and was pursuing him relentlessly. The golden-haired Tiger King was extremely fast. As soon as this thought appeared in Jianchen's head, he could already faintly hear the wild winds and the rustling of weeds as the golden-haired Tiger King ran behind him. Jianchen's heart immediately became heavy. Against a powerful magical beast of the 5th step, there was nothing he could do other than run. And now, in front of the golden-haired Tiger King's terrifying speed, He did not have the ability to run even if he wanted to. After all, speed was the specialty of tiger-type magical beasts, not to mention the fact that he was facing a magical beast of the 5th step this time. The saint force within him circulated at full force and Xianxian's leaping speed increased by another 30%. Now, he was using his full strength, using the limit of his speed. At the same time, Xianxian quickly thought of a countermeasure, but after thinking for a long time, he still could not come up with a good plan. Unless he encountered an Earth Saint Master or a magical beast that was hostile to the golden-haired Tiger King and could stop it, he had no chance of escaping. With the golden-haired Tiger King's speed, it would catch up to him very quickly. However, the chances of encountering an Earth Saint Master or a powerful magical beast that was hostile to the golden-haired Tiger King in the outskirts of the magical Beast Mountain range were extremely slim. They were basically impossible to happen. Roar! The golden-haired Tiger King's furious roar rang out from behind him again. This time, Xianxian could already see the golden-haired Tiger King's huge body. It was only 20 meters away from him. Xianxian's face suddenly became ugly. Death was not scary. Having already died once, he did not fear death. However, he still had the person he cared about the most in this world, so he was unwilling to die like this no matter what. At this moment, the golden-haired Tiger King suddenly leapt up, turning into a black blur as it pounced at Xianxian. Chapter 124. Xianxian's body was still in midair and had no place to exert force. The golden-haired Tiger King's speed was very fast, so he had no time to dodge. In a moment of desperation, Xianxian suddenly turned around and punched the golden-haired Tiger King's head with both hands. Borrowing the rebound force, his body that was originally flying forward suddenly accelerated and finally escaped the golden-haired Tiger King's bloody mouth. Xianxian's footsteps staggered as he landed on the ground. Just before he could stabilize his body, a strong force came from his chest. Before he could see clearly what was going on, his body was like a cannonball and was sent flying far away. The clothes on his chest were completely torn, and his entire chest had sunk in. His chest was almost touching his back, and there was a strong force that entered his body, instantly crushing his internal organs. Xianxian flew for a distance of 30 meters, and finally his body hit a big tree before falling down. His head directly made intimate contact with the hard trunk of the tree, causing Xianxian to faint and fall unconscious on the ground. The golden-haired Tiger King did not intend to let Xianxian go. It jumped in front of Xianxian, opened its bloody mouth, and bit towards Xianxian. Just as the golden-haired Tiger King's huge mouth was about to bite Xianxian's body, suddenly, a weak purple and green light shot out from Xianxian's body. The light flashed and disappeared. Although the purple and green light was very weak, it was still very eye-catching in this dark night. When the purple and green light appeared, the surrounding forest was suddenly enveloped by a strong sword aura. However, this sudden strong sword aura also flashed and disappeared. Ayo! At the same time, the golden-haired Tiger King let out a mournful cry. There was a very rare trace of panic in the voice. Then, the golden-haired Tiger King's huge body retreated more than 10 meters away, as if it had been electrocuted. Its pair of tiger eyes stared at the unconscious Xianxian on the ground in bewilderment. Those originally red tiger eyes of the golden-haired Tiger King also became sober in an instant. In its eyes, there was a strong sense of fear, and its whole body was slightly trembling. Then, bright red blood flowed out from all over the golden-haired Tiger King's body. In the blink of an eye, its whole body was dyed red. At this moment, the golden-haired Tiger King's golden fur had completely turned blood red. On its body, there were countless scars. The scars were small, but they were so deep that the bones could be seen. One after another, there were so many scars that it was impossible to count. Even the tiger head was no exception. It looked very miserable. The current golden-haired Tiger King was no longer as majestic as it was before. Instead, it looked more like it had just experienced an extremely fierce battle and was severely injured. It was extremely miserable. The golden-haired Tiger King's huge body was slightly trembling. Its pair of tiger eyes were filled with fear as it stared at the unconscious Jianchen on the ground. At this moment, all of a sudden, with Jianchen as the center, all the grass and trees within a radius of 100 meters turned into powder. The powder covered the sky and covered the entire space within 100 meters. It was so dense that even one's line of sight was severely obstructed. The golden-haired Tiger King's body trembled even more violently. Its pair of tiger eyes looked at everything around it in disbelief. Its expression was lifeless. A Class 5 magical beast already possessed some basic intelligence. Although it was unable to communicate with humans, it could still think. Its intelligence was comparable to humans. The scene before its eyes deeply shocked the golden-haired Tiger King. With its strength as a Class 5 magical beast, it could easily destroy all the trees within a radius of 100 meters. However, to silently turn all the plants within 100 meters into powder in an instant, even a Class 6 magical beast would not be able to do it. In particular, the sudden appearance of a powerful sword qi made the golden-haired Tiger King tremble with fear. In just an instant, its entire body was cut by this invisible sword qi, causing it to be deeply frightened. A moment later, when the powder fell to the ground, a thick layer of powder had already accumulated on the ground. Within 100 meters, there was no trace of any plants. Apart from the powder on the ground, there was nothing else. Even the tree beside Jianchen that was large enough for two people to wrap their arms around had disappeared without a trace. The golden-haired Tiger King's pair of eyes looked around, then it let out a frightened cry. With its tail between its legs, it flew away from this place. Its speed was even faster than when it was chasing Jianchen. After the golden-haired Tiger King left, the entire open area became silent in an instant. Only Jianchen was left lying there alone in an unconscious state. His body was already covered with a thick layer of powder. Time passed quietly. As the night sky gradually receded, a fiery red sun slowly rose from the east, emitting rays of light that warmed the earth. In the open area of the magical beast forest, there was no plant cover, but the golden sunlight dyed the open area into a golden carpet. This night, perhaps because there were traces of a 5th-rank magical beast that had stayed here before, there were no magical beasts in the surroundings. Even the common wild beasts and some small animals didn't appear. It was unknown whether they didn't come to this place at all, or simply didn't dare to approach this area. All of a sudden, in the center of this spacious area, a slightly protruding pile of powder trembled slightly. Following this tremble, the entire pile of powder began to tremble violently. The plant powder at the top began to slide down one after another, gradually revealing a human body. It was Jianchen who had been buried by the plant powder at night. Brushing away the strange powder that had mysteriously appeared on his body, Jianchen slowly opened his eyes. The blue sky came into view. Just as Jianchen was about to raise his head, his brain exerted a bit of force. Immediately, it affected the injuries in his body. Immediately, an intense pain spread through his body, causing Jianchen to involuntarily groan. Lying powerlessly on the ground, Jianchen let out a long sigh. He didn't even need to use his inner sight. Just by relying on his powerful mind, Jianchen was able to clearly sense the extent of his injuries. His 5 viscera and 6 bowels had all been severely injured. Although his injuries were much lighter than the ones he had suffered at Wake City, they were still fatal to anyone else. His chest was already a mess of flesh and blood. Even his bones were completely shattered by the golden-haired Tiger King's tail. Chapter 125. Surprise flashed through Jianchen's eyes when he saw this. He was at a loss as he murmured, "Strange, where is this? Where's the golden Tiger King? Have I been saved by someone?" Just like that, Jianchen lay on the ground. He only turned his head slightly and looked around. He calmed down very quickly. However, he thought about how the people of the Flame Mercenaries had used their lives to keep the Golden Tiger King busy in order to cover his escape. Jianchen felt sorrow when he thought of that. Although he had only known the Flame Mercenaries for less than a month, Jianchen had gotten along well with them during that time. He had already established a friendship with them. Although it was not very deep, The fact that the flame mercenaries were willing to give up their lives to stop the Golden Tiger King at the last moment to buy him time to escape was mostly because they all knew that it was impossible for them to escape from a Class 5 magical beast. However, this still dealt a huge blow to Jianshan's heart. Uncle Kendall, dear, Chang Ningfeng, Hupa Todkai, Zhou Shaokai, Xiao Dao Yuxian, don't worry. Once I have enough strength in the future, I will definitely avenge you. I will kill the Golden Tiger King with my own hands, Jianshan said resentfully as he laid on the ground. His voice was filled with killing intent. A while later, Jianshan sucked in a deep breath and slowly calmed himself down. He studied his surroundings again. Jianshan was extremely puzzled as to how he had escaped from the Golden Tiger King. At the same time, the environment here was very different from before he had fainted. Where is this place? Who saved me? Jianshan was filled with questions as he looked around in confusion. Whatever, now's not the time to think about that. My priority is to heal my wounds. With that in mind, Jianshan cast aside his thoughts and began to control the radiant saint force in the surroundings to heal himself. The wondrous energy in the surroundings rapidly gathered towards Jianshan. When it reached a certain point, it gradually turned into a milky white light, enveloping Jianshan. As the radiant saint force constantly flowed into Jianshan's body, Jianshan's wounds healed at a visible rate. For hours later, Jianshan's soul was exhausted, so he needed to stop. After 4 hours of healing, Jianshan's wounds had not completely healed, but they no longer affected his basic mobility. Slowly dispersing the radiant saint force, Jianshan slowly climbed up from the ground. He took off his tattered clothes and changed into a new set of clothes from his space belt. At this moment, Jianshan suddenly discovered that there was a thick layer of plant powder on the ground. Slowly bending down, Jianshan gently grabbed a handful of the powder on the ground. It was cold to the touch and slightly moist. At the same time, there was a special smell that only plants could have. Gently rubbing the powder in his right hand, a sliver of surprise gradually appeared in Jianshan's eyes. He cried out softly, "This is actually plant powder." With that, Jianshan suddenly raised his head and looked around. He saw that there was a thick layer of plant powder on the ground within 100 meters of him. Beyond that, there were trees and weeds everywhere. Seeing this, Jianshan trembled slightly. A thought that even he dared not believe suddenly appeared in his head. Don't tell me that all the plants within 100 meters of him have turned into this pile of powder? Thinking of this, Jianshan could not help but reveal a sliver of shock. Although he did not know what had happened before he fainted, he understood very well just how difficult it was to turn all the plants within 100 meters of him into powder without harming the road and the surrounding environment. Just controlling such a powerful force was not an easy task. Just what happened here? Jianshan's head was filled with doubts. At the same time, he felt extremely curious. Afterwards, Jianshan did not stay there any longer. Using the sun in the sky as a compass, he determined the direction and wanted to leave. As for this strange place and what had happened when he fainted last night, Jianshan did not want to waste his time thinking about it. In short, he was extremely lucky to be able to survive. Because Jianshan had yet to fully recover from his injuries, he was extremely careful along the way. He did not want to attract any more unnecessary trouble from magical beasts, so he did not advance very quickly. Jianshan traveled for 2 days before finally exiting the mountain range of magical beasts. He arrived at a forest on the outskirts. Jianshan's injuries had also completely healed in these 2 days. Jianshan leisurely walked through the dense forest, but his heart was heavy. When they had first arrived, they had a total of 10 people, but now he was the only one left. Apart from him, everyone else of the flame mercenaries had been eternally buried in the mountain range of magical beasts. Not even their corpses were left behind. Just at this moment, a group of people dressed as mercenaries walked towards Jianshan. Looking at the direction they were heading, it was obvious that they had entered the mountain range of magical beasts. The group had a total of 7 people. Aside from a young man who seemed to be in his 20s, the other 6 were middle-aged men around the age of 40. It was obvious with a single glance that the young man was being protected by the 6 middle-aged men. The 7 people dressed as mercenaries had clearly noticed Xianxia as well, but they did not take him to heart. Just as the 7 mercenaries were about to pass by Xianxia, a voice filled with arrogance suddenly rang out, "Kid, stop right there." The person who had spoken was the young man who did not seem much older than Xianxia. Xianxia did not seem to hear the voice behind him at all. He continued to walk with his head lowered and a heavy heart. Seeing Xianxia actually ignore him, the young man's face could not help but change slightly. He stared coldly at Xianxia's back before yelling out again, "You brat in linen clothes, are you deaf? Did you not hear what I said?" The young man's tone was extremely arrogant and his face was filled with arrogance. Xianxia paused slightly and raised his head to look at the young man. He asked calmly, "Are you calling me mother?" "Nonsense, if this young master didn't call you, who else would I call? Is there anyone else here other than you?" The young man's tone was rude and unreasonable. He did not realize that he was speaking ill. Weren't he and the 6 middle-aged men beside him human? The faces of the 6 middle-aged men twitched slightly when they heard the young man's ill words. They wanted to laugh, but they did not dare to do so. Xianxia furrowed his brow and said in a low voice, "What do you want to say? Speak quickly." Having just experienced the tragedy of the flame mercenaries, Xianxia was currently in an extremely bad mood. Even the tone of his voice had changed quite a bit. A trace of anger flashed across the young man's face. He also felt very angry that Xianxia had spoken to him so rudely. "Kid, this young master is asking you, did you come from the mountain range of magical beasts?" The young man's voice had already risen a few octaves. He looked at Xianxia with an extremely unfriendly gaze. Hearing this, a cold light flashed through Xianxia's eyes. He said in a low voice, "So what if I did?" Chapter 126. Hearing the young man's words, Xianxia's already bad mood became even worse. Irritation rose from the bottom of his heart. In an instant, Xianxia's originally unfocused and lifeless eyes became fierce. He stared fiercely at the young man like an unsheathed sword and said in a low voice, "Scram. What qualifications do you have to make me lead the way for you?" Xianxia's tone carried a thick killing intent. As soon as Xianxia's voice fell, the expressions of the 6 middle-aged men around the young man changed slightly. Their fierce gazes immediately stared over in unison. Being stared at by Xianxia's sword-like gaze, the young man's heart couldn't help but tremble. A sense of timidity quietly appeared in his heart, and he even took a slight step back. However, soon after, the young man discovered his loss of self-control. A wave of anger rose from his heart, and he quickly extinguished the trace of timidity in his heart. To think that with his noble status, he was actually frightened by a mercenary who was about the same age as him. This was definitely an unerasable disgrace for him. The young man stared at Xianxia with a face full of anger. He suddenly took a step forward and pointed at Xianxia. He shouted sternly, "Stinking brat, what did you say to this young master? Try saying it again if you have the guts." Xianxia's fierce gaze swept over the 6 middle-aged men around the young man. He could clearly see their strength at a glance. With his powerful spirit, he only needed to sense the aura leaking out of the 6 people to determine their exact strength. 1 high-rank Saint Master, 2 low-rank Saint Masters, and 3 high-rank Great Saints. This kind of strength was much stronger than the Raging Flame mercenary group. "Scram," Xianxia said coldly again without any trace of politeness. Although he had already deduced from the young man's lineup and tone that he was definitely a disciple of some large family, Xianxia was already all alone at this moment. He had no worries and didn't fear any power at all. At most, it would just be a bit more trouble. Although it wasn't very comfortable to be in trouble, it was impossible for Xianxia to humble himself and apologize to a good-for-nothing disciple because of this. The young man's face became very gloomy. He stared coldly at Xianxia and ordered the 6 people around him, "Capture him for me." "Yes, young master." One of them immediately spoke. Then he walked out of the group and strode forward to Xianxia. He grabbed Xianxia's shoulder with his bare hands. This middle-aged man possessed the strength of a high-rank great saint. This was the result of more than 30 years of cultivation. In his opinion, Xianxia was so young, so he definitely wouldn't be too powerful. Those who could reach the strength of a high-rank saint were first-rate geniuses. With his strength as a high-rank great saint, capturing Xianxia would be a piece of cake. A cold glint flashed through Xianxia's eyes. He leaned slightly to the side and effortlessly avoided the middle-aged man's hand. He said coldly, "You don't have the qualifications to fight with me." Xianxia's tone was full of disdain. If it was any other time, Xianxia definitely wouldn't say something like this. However, the experience of the flame mercenaries had greatly affected his state of mind. He no longer had his usual elegance. The young man's arrogant attitude caused Xianxia's already bad mood to become even more irritable. He even had the urge to kill someone from the depths of his heart. The middle-aged man's face immediately became unsightly when he heard Xianxia's humiliating words. He was a high-rank great saint, but not only was he unable to defeat a brat in his early 20s, he had even been mercilessly humiliated. This made him lose a lot of face, especially when there were a few companions standing guard behind him. One of them was a good-for-nothing disciple who could affect his future. If he didn't properly teach this brat a lesson today, he probably wouldn't be able to raise his head in front of his companions in the future. Thinking of this, the middle-aged man decided not to hold back. A long sword appeared in his hand as he continuously poured his saint chi into it, causing it to emit a layer of dreamy light. "Arrogant brat, I'll let you see if I have the qualifications to fight with you," the middle-aged man shouted as he swung his sword towards Xianxia's shoulder. Xianxia coldly snorted as the light wind sword appeared in his right hand. It turned into a silver-white ray of light as it pierced out like lightning. Piff! Just as the middle-aged man's sword was about to strike out, Xianxia's light wind sword had already pierced his throat. The middle-aged man's entire body suddenly stiffened as he stared at Xianxia and the small sword that had pierced his throat. His eyes were filled with disbelief. Then, the middle-aged man's eyes gradually lost their luster. His eyes quickly became hollow as his body slumped to the ground, dying with a grievance. Seeing that the middle-aged man had been killed by Xianxia in a single strike, the other 5 guards who had been guarding the middle-aged man were stunned. Their faces immediately changed as they unsheathed their saint weapons and stared at Xianxia as if they were facing a great enemy. The young man couldn't believe his eyes as he looked at the corpse of the middle-aged man lying on the ground. Pointing at Xianxia, he tried to put on a brave front. "You dare to kill my guards? Do you know who I am? You brat, are you tired of living?" Although the young man's age was about the same as Xianxia's, he had clearly grown up in a sheltered environment and hadn't experienced much. Now that he had seen such a bloody scene, he couldn't help but reveal his cowardice. Although he had used his family's influence to bully a lot of people, those people were all cowards and didn't dare to offend him. This had allowed him to live a smooth life without putting anyone in his eyes. He had never seen someone as cold-blooded and heartless as Xianxia, killing people so straightforwardly as if it was a common occurrence. The young man who had never seen such a scene was immediately frightened by Xianxia's ruthless methods. At this moment, a middle-aged man with a resolute expression stepped forward and clasped his hands towards Xianxia. He calmly said, "Little brother, we are from the Tianxiong clan, and this is the young master of the Xianxiong clan. What happened before was indeed our fault, and I apologize to you. Let's let this matter pass." The middle-aged man's tone was neither servile nor overbearing. Chapter 127. Xianxia glared at the group of people in front of him. His body emitted a strong killing intent as he walked towards them with his sword in hand. He coldly said, "Make your move. If you can escape from my hands today, I'll naturally let you go." The 5 middle-aged men's expressions changed slightly. The one who had spoken earlier also had a gloomy expression as he said, "Friend, you really don't know what's good for you. If it weren't for the fact that we were escorting the young master to the magical Beast Mountain range and that the Patriarch had instructed us not to cause any trouble along the way, did you really think that just because you killed one of our companions, this matter would be resolved so easily? Although our Tianxiong clan isn't one of the most famous clans in the Tianyuan continent, we aren't so easily bullied. The middle-aged man's words made the youth think of his own clan's strength. His confidence was boosted as he sternly said, "You're right. Our Tianxiong clan isn't so easily bullied. In Wake City, there isn't a single clan that doesn't fear our Tianxiong clan. Little brat, you've already killed one of my guards. If you know what's good for you, you'll immediately return with me to receive your punishment. Otherwise, you'll leave your life here today." Hearing the youth's words, the middle-aged man couldn't help but frown as he inwardly cursed, "Idiot." Although the Tianxiong clan wasn't weak, that was only when compared to Wake City. Even in Wake City, the Tianxiong clan's position was extremely dangerous. Even though Wake City was only a third-class city, there were still over 20 clans of various sizes. Although the Tianxiong clan seemed to be the most powerful clan in Wake City, the middle-aged man was very clear that although the Tianxiong clan seemed to be extremely powerful on the surface, they had already become a thorn in the side of many other clans in Wake City. After all, a tall tree attracts the wind. In Wake City, there were many clans that weren't much weaker than the Tianxiong clan. They all had their eyes on the Tianxiong clan. Once the opportunity came, they wouldn't hesitate to attack the Tianxiong clan and divide up the Tianxiong clan's territory. This was because the Tianxiong clan that had dominated Wake City for over 10 years already controlled a third of the city's businesses. With such a large piece of fat meat, the surrounding clans had long since coveted it. Moreover, because Wake City was close to the magical Beast Mountain range, the flow of people in the city was very large. 99% of the people in the city were mercenaries from all over the world. There were also many large and small foreign clans. The entire Wake City could be said to be a mix of crooks and honest folk. Although the Tianxiong clan seemed to have an extremely large amount of influence and connections in Wake City, and even maintained a cooperative relationship with a few mid-sized mercenary groups, there were still many powerful clans and wandering experts that the Tianxiong clan couldn't afford to offend. Otherwise, the Tianxiong clan's only fate would be destruction. When the middle-aged man saw that Jianchen had the strength to easily kill a high-level great saint at such a young age, especially that lightning-fast sword strike, the middle-aged man couldn't help but be shocked. That sword strike was so fast that even he would have to use all of his strength to dodge it. With the middle-aged man's experience, he could roughly guess that Jianchen's background wasn't weak. Or perhaps he had an extremely powerful master behind him. Otherwise, how could he be so strong at such a young age? Because of this, the middle-aged man wanted to resolve this grudge. He didn't want to cause trouble for the Tianxiong clan. However, when Jianchen heard the words of the young master of the Tianxiong clan, his eyes flashed with a cold light. Without saying a word, his body slightly swayed as he rushed towards the young man. The light wind sword in his hand turned into a silver light as it pierced out like lightning towards the young man's throat. Although Jianchen already knew in his heart that this young man was the young master of the Tianxiong clan, he had never been afraid of any power. Seeing Jianchen act so decisively, the middle-aged man's face slightly changed. His eyes flashed with a trace of ruthlessness as a two-handed greatsword appeared in his hands. The middle-aged man tightly gripped the hilt of the greatsword and suddenly swung it out. Along with the sound of the greatsword breaking through the air, the greatsword went straight towards Jianchen's light wind sword. Although the middle-aged man guessed that Jianchen had a powerful background, he wasn't someone who was afraid of trouble. The trajectory of Jianchen's sword suddenly changed. He raised his sword and actually took the initiative to receive the middle-aged man's huge sword. Ding! Following the sound of metal colliding, Jianchen's light wind sword and the middle-aged man's great sword collided in midair. As soon as the two came into contact, a powerful force was transmitted from the middle-aged man's great sword to Jianchen's light wind sword. Jianchen's face became serious as he used his right arm to control the light wind sword to disperse the force transmitted from the greatsword. At the same time, his feet quickly moved and he circled behind the middle-aged man. Using the advantage of his sword to its fullest, he began to attack the middle-aged man like a torrential storm. Jianchen's strength was increasing every day. At this time, he was able to fight head-on with the middle-aged man who was a high-level Saint Master. Of course, the main reason for this was because the middle-aged man wasn't a strength-type warrior. It was just that his Saint Qi was stronger than Jianqin's. As the two of them fought, the other four guards also surrounded the young master of the Tianxiong clan and quickly retreated. In just a few breaths of time, the middle-aged man and Jianqin had already exchanged more than 10 moves. The more the middle-aged man fought, the more apprehensive he became. This was because Jianqin's sword was just too fast. Not only was it extremely fast, but it was also deadly. The seemingly chaotic sword technique seemed to contain some kind of mystery that the middle-aged man didn't understand. Every move was seamless and he couldn't find a single flaw. Even though the middle-aged man was a high-level saint, he could only maintain a stalemate with Jianqin. Moreover, the longer the battle dragged on, the more disadvantageous it would be for him. This was because Jianqin's sword technique was so fast that it was difficult for the middle-aged man to dodge. Although there wouldn't be any problems for the time being, it was only a matter of time before he would be defeated. This was because when faced with Jianqin's lightning-fast sword technique, he could only defend himself. Even his chances of counterattacking were pitifully small. "Higher, fascists, you two come help me. Tianfeng, you two immediately protect the young master and leave." After holding on for a while, the middle-aged man had no choice but to call for reinforcements. Facing Jianqin's incomparably fast sword, the middle-aged man was almost unable to dodge several times. Chapter 128. Two of the four guards immediately separated, charging at Jianqin with their saint weapons. They joined the battle very quickly, attacking Jianqin together with the middle-aged man who was a high-level saint master. The two guards who hurried over afterwards were precisely the only two initial-level sacred experts in the group. With the addition of these two initial-level sacred experts, the pressure on Jianqin immediately increased by quite a bit. However, with his profound footwork and swift sword, he was still evenly matched against the three sacred experts, not falling into any disadvantage at all. The young man also felt a trace of fear in his heart. Under the protection of the other two high-level saint masters, he quickly escaped and disappeared from sight. Although Jianqin sensed that the young man had left, he didn't chase after him. This was because the three primary saint masters in front of him wouldn't allow Jianqin to leave and harm the young master of the Tianxiong clan. Jianqin and the three Tianxiong clan guards fought fiercely in the forest. Many of the surrounding weeds and trees were affected by the shockwaves of their battle. The area was a mess, and there were even a few large trees that had been broken. After dodging another huge sword that came from the side, Jianqin unleashed a vicious attack against a middle-aged man with the strength of an early-stage saint master. He planned on killing them one by one. Following the sound of the air being pierced, Jianqin's light wind sword suddenly turned into a blur as it pierced towards the primary saint master several times. This forced the primary saint master's hands into a mess. In the end, Jianqin forced the primary saint master to reveal an opening. Taking advantage of this opening, the light wind sword in Jianqin's hand suddenly trembled. Afterwards, it turned into a silver bolt of lightning as it pierced towards the primary saint master. Before the primary saint master could even react, the light wind sword had already pierced through his throat. The bloodied sword tip came out from the other side of his throat. "Higher!" Seeing the middle-aged man's throat being pierced by a sword, the other two people's expressions changed greatly, and they let out a cry that was mixed with some grief. Jianqin's hands didn't stop moving at all. Just as the light wind sword was about to pierce through the middle-aged man's throat, she immediately pulled it out. Taking advantage of the moment when the two of them were distracted, her body swayed slightly, and like a ghost, she silently appeared in front of the middle-aged man who was at the Saint Master level. The light wind sword in her hand once again turned into a streak of white lightning and stabbed towards the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man's expression changed, and he immediately raised his saint weapon to block in front of his throat. Just as the light wind sword was about to hit his great sword, the light wind sword suddenly dipped down, avoiding the great sword in front of the middle-aged man. Then, the light wind sword pierced through the great sword in front of him, and pierced upwards. The light wind sword's sudden change didn't give the middle-aged man any time to react. In the end, the middle-aged man could only stare in disbelief as the light wind sword pierced through his throat. Right at this moment, a biting cold wind came from behind Xianxia. A 3-inch wide greatsword carrying a powerful saint force cut through the air towards Xianxia. Before the sword even arrived, the pressure from the wind caused Xianxia's clothes to stick tightly to his back. Feeling the biting cold wind coming from behind him, Xianxia didn't hesitate and immediately pulled out the light wind sword and turned around to block in front of him. Clang! The great sword carried a powerful saint force as it fiercely struck the light wind sword. A powerful force was transmitted from the great sword, forcing Xianxia to continuously retreat. After repelling Xianxia, the middle-aged man looked at the guard whose throat had been pierced by Xianxia. Fresh blood was gushing out from the guard's throat like a fountain. The guard's eyes gradually lost their luster as his body slowly fell to the ground. His eyes suddenly turned red as he stared at Xianxia like a bloodthirsty beast. He angrily said, "Today, even if I have to give up my life, I will kill you and avenge my brother." As soon as he finished speaking, a powerful saint force gathered around the greatsword in the middle-aged man's hands. Raising the greatsword high up, the middle-aged man took heavy steps towards Xianxia. Xianxia stared at the middle-aged man with a dignified expression. He couldn't help but tighten his grip on the light wind sword. He could already see that the middle-aged man was planning to fight to the death with him. Facing a high-level Saint Master who didn't fear death, Xianxia would have a hard time dealing with him. After all, he was only a mid-level Saint Master. Currently, his strength was only at the level of a mid-level Great Saint. There was still a considerable distance between him and a high-level Saint Master. The light wind sword emitted a layer of white light that was much denser than before. A trace of sharp sword chi was emitted from the light wind sword. Just as the middle-aged man was about to reach Xianxia, Xianxia's right arm suddenly shook, and the light wind sword in his hand pierced through the air. A small silver sword chi shot out from the tip of the sword, flying towards the middle-aged man at a speed that was hard to see with the naked eye. Facing this needle-sized sword chi, the middle-aged man didn't dare to be careless. The speed of the sword chi was extremely fast and there was no time to dodge. Helpless, the middle-aged man could only use his great sword to fiercely chop down. When the light wind sword collided with Xianxia's sword chi, there wasn't the slightest bit of resistance. The great sword easily dispersed the sword chi. At this moment, Xianxia suddenly moved. His movements were like a ghost, and in the blink of an eye, he appeared in front of the middle-aged man. The light wind sword in his hand turned into a blur as he attacked the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man immediately withdrew his great sword and blocked Xianxia's attack. Soon after, the two of them began to fiercely fight again. In his previous life, Xianxia's swordsmanship had reached the pinnacle of perfection. Now that he was facing the middle-aged man, he was able to display the essence of his swordsmanship. Not only was the speed of his sword inconceivably fast, but it was also used to perfection. Even though the middle-aged man was much stronger than Xianxia, he couldn't last long against Xianxia's attacks and was once again forced into a defensive position. Xianxia continuously attacked the middle-aged man from different directions. The slender light wind sword had already turned into a blur, making it impossible to see the blade clearly. Under Xianxia's fast attacks, the middle-aged man found it more and more difficult to block. Moreover, every attack of the light wind sword was fatal. The middle-aged man didn't even have the chance to injure Xianxia. Right now, the middle-aged man's heart was filled with regret. At the same time, he hated the eldest young master of the Tianxiong clan. Originally, nothing should have happened, but the eldest young master of the Tianxiong clan didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth. He actually took the initiative to provoke this fiend in front of him. Not only did he cause trouble for no reason, but he also caused the death of two of his brothers who had been friends with him for more than 10 years. Even he himself had fallen into a dangerous situation. Chapter 129. The middle-aged man stared blankly at the small sword that had pierced his heart. He couldn't believe that a high-level Saint Master like him would actually die at the hands of a high-level Great Saint Master who wasn't even a high-level Great Saint Master. Moreover, this youth only looked to be in his 20s. Thinking about how he had cultivated for 50 years to reach his current level of strength, yet he couldn't even defeat a youth who looked to be in his 20s. In the end, because of the Tianxiong clan's young master, not only did he destroy his Saint Qi that he had cultivated for 50 years, he even lost his life in the wilderness. Thinking about this, the middle-aged man felt a burst of sorrow in his heart. As the life force in his body continued to flow away, the middle-aged man's bright eyes gradually dimmed. Finally, they turned into emptiness, and his burly body slowly fell to the ground. Xianxia slowly put away the light wind sword. The blood on the sword seemed to have a life of its own as it flowed towards the tip of the sword. Finally, it turned into drops of blood that dripped down from the tip of the sword. Because of the battle between the three people, the ground had already become moist and bumpy. Xianxia slowly took a few deep breaths. Killing 2 low-level Saint Masters and 1 high-level Saint Master had consumed quite a bit of his energy. Facing 3 opponents who were far stronger than him, Xianxia had already gone all out. If it wasn't for the fact that his strength had increased a lot after reaching the mid-level Great Saint realm, he would have needed to spend a lot more time to kill these 3 Saint Masters. However, after killing the 3 people, Xianxia's sorrow from the deaths of Captain Kendall and the others was surprisingly diluted by quite a bit. Xianxia calmly looked at the 3 corpses. Finally, his eyes landed on the 3 space belts on their waists. After a slight hesitation, he slowly walked forward and removed the belts one by one to check the items inside. Due to the fact that Xianxia had spent 100 times more on his own cultivation than other people, he urgently needed a large amount of demon cores. With the high price of demon cores, Xianxia obviously didn't have the money to buy them. Therefore, if he wanted to obtain demon cores, he could only obtain them by killing demon beasts or robbing dead people. Moreover, robbing dead people of their belongings was very common in the Tianyuan continent. After all, there was a 30% chance that the fights that happened on the continent were caused by greed. After removing the 3 space belts, Xianxia checked the items inside. Although the 3 of them were Saint Masters, they clearly weren't very rich. Aside from some daily necessities and tools, there was basically nothing else. In the end, Xianxia only found less than 10 purple crystal coins, 15 Class 2 monster cores, and 5 Class 3 monster cores in the 3 space belts. Xianxia didn't hesitate at all and immediately put the monster cores into his own space belt. After looking at the 10 purple crystal coins on the ground, he hesitated for a moment before putting them all into his space belt. Although it wasn't a lot, it was still quite a fortune to the commoners. It would be a pity to just leave it here and waste it. After putting away the items, Xianxia directly threw the 3 space belts to the side. He didn't even bother to deal with the corpses and directly left the place. By the time he returned to Wake City, it was already close to evening. Xianxia casually ate some food in a restaurant before directly asking for a room to rest. Because Xianxia only asked for a very ordinary room, the furnishings were very simple. There was only a wooden table, a few stools, and a bed. Aside from that, there was nothing else. Even so, the room was still very clean. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it was spotless. At night, a bright full moon hung high in the night sky, emitting a bright silver-white moonlight that dyed the dark sky a faint silver-white. Even the thin clouds in the sky could be seen clearly. Xianxia moved a chair in front of the window and sat down. He raised his head to look at the bright full moon in the sky and sank into deep thought. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to say that he was in a daze. In Xianxia's mind, he continuously recalled the 2 days when the Flame Mercenary Group had been chased by the Class 5 Golden Fur Tiger King. In the end, the Flame Mercenary Group had paid the price of their own lives to delay the Golden Fur Tiger King and cover his escape. Although 2 days had already passed and the grief in his heart from the deaths of the Flame Mercenary Group had been greatly diluted, Xianxia still couldn't forget that scene. That scene was like a brand that had been deeply imprinted into the depths of his soul. He would probably never be able to forget it for the rest of his life. He and the Flame Mercenary Group could be said to have met by chance. Although their relationship had become much closer after these few days of interaction, in the final moment, they would rather die to cover for Xianxia's escape. Although there was a bit of selfishness in their actions, as well as knowing that they simply didn't have the ability to escape from the Golden Fur Tiger King's pursuit, it still left a huge impact on Xianxian's heart. Captain Kendall, what is your greatest wish in life? My greatest wish in life is for the Flame Mercenary Group to become the greatest mercenary group on the continent. Scenes from the past constantly flashed through Xianxian's head. Xianxian sat by the window as his somewhat dazed eyes gradually recovered. He clenched his fists tightly and murmured, Captain Kendall, you're the strongest in our Flame Mercenary Group. I never thought that you would be the first to leave back then. You were the one who took care of me the most in the past few days. Now that you're gone, your greatest wish can't be fulfilled. Then, let me fulfill your wish for you. I, Xianxian, promise you that I will do my very best in my life to make the Flame Mercenary Group the greatest mercenary group on the continent. Xianxian's voice was filled with determination. Taking off the space belt from his waist, Xianxian stared at it blankly. He could not help but think about what Captain Kendall had said when he passed the belt to him. Xianxian, don't refuse. If we don't make it out of this forest alive, we'll have to rely on you to take care of our families. If we all die here, their lives will become extremely difficult. Whether my parents, my wife, and my child can live a good life in the future will all depend on you, Xianxian said. Xianxian let out a long sigh when he thought up to there. He suddenly felt extremely guilty. Captain Kendall had passed the space belt to Xianxian in order to ask him to take care of his family. However, he did not even know what their names were or where they lived. How was he supposed to deal with this? Now, Xianxian suddenly became extremely worried. Since Captain Kendall had asked him to take care of his family, Xianxian had already guessed that Kendall's family must be extremely poor. He wondered if his family would be able to live happily after losing their pillar of support. As soon as he thought about the difficult days ahead for Kendall's family, Xianxian was filled with urgency. He wanted to find Kendall's family as soon as possible so that he could hand over what Kendall had entrusted to him so that they could live happily ever after. Xianxian sat by the window until the latter half of the night before returning to his bed to cultivate. Right now, Xianxian needed to become stronger, and stronger. The night was very peaceful and passed quickly. The next morning, Xianxian suddenly opened his eyes while immersed in cultivation. For some reason, he suddenly had a bad feeling. Chapter 130. Looking at the crowd below, Xianxian's face suddenly became serious. Ever since he saw the young master of the Tianxiong clan standing in the crowd, he had already guessed that the reason these people were gathered here so early in the morning was probably because of him. After all, not only did he offend the young master of the Tianxiong clan yesterday, he also killed 3 of their guards who were not weak. In short, he had already formed an enmity with the Tianxiong clan. After all, in a remote place like Wake City, a high-level Saint Master was already considered a decent expert. No matter which clan in Wake City, a high-level Saint Master status would not be too low. If a family lost a high-level Sacred Expert and 2 initial-level Sacred Expert level experts for no reason, if they couldn't get back their face, then this family's deterrence in the market would undoubtedly decrease by a lot. This was extremely important for a family's future development. Now that the entire restaurant was surrounded by the Tianxiong clan, wanting to leave without being noticed was as difficult as ascending to the heavens. Helpless, Xianxian could only walk out of the room and walk towards the entrance of the restaurant. Although the disaster had already arrived and there were over 100 people on the other side, there was no lack of experts among them. However, Xianxian's face did not reveal the slightest trace of panic or worry. His expression was as calm as ever. When Xianxian walked down the stairs and arrived at the bottom floor of the restaurant, there were already quite a few people gathered here. This was the peak time for breakfast. The entire restaurant's tables were filled with bowls, chopsticks, and plates of fragrant meat. However, there was no one sitting at these tables to enjoy this sumptuous breakfast. Everyone stood up from their chairs while cursing and walking slowly towards the entrance of the restaurant. Their faces were filled with indignation. The Tianxiong clan is really fucking arrogant. I was just eating here and now they suddenly want all of us to leave. You can deal with your own matters, but what does it have to do with us? We'll eat our food and not get in your way. That's right. The Xianxia clan really thinks they're the #1 clan in Wake City. They can do whatever they want here. They're just a small clan in Wake City. If they were to meet the famous experts of the Tianyuan continent, they'd only need to lift a finger to exterminate them. Most of the people eating in the restaurant were mercenaries. A few of the more violent and courageous mercenaries began to complain, but their voices were very soft. It was as if they were muttering to themselves, but no one dared to say it out loud. Even so, these mercenaries had a certain level of strength and could clearly hear the muttering. As for the merchants in the restaurant, most of them didn't dare to show the slightest bit of dissatisfaction. They obediently left their seats and hurriedly walked out of the restaurant. Only the merchants with a certain level of strength showed a trace of indifference. However, almost all of them were outsiders. Although many of them didn't fear the Xianxia clan, a strong dragon couldn't suppress a snake in its own territory. For such a trivial matter, they obviously wouldn't want to provoke the Xianxia clan for no good reason, so they all got up and left the restaurant. At the entrance of the restaurant, there were 4 middle-aged men in white robes standing guard. Their gazes were like lightning as they constantly scanned the people walking out of the restaurant. Although they could hear the dissatisfaction and curses of the mercenaries towards the Xianxia clan, they didn't dare to make a sound. It was as if they hadn't heard a thing. The mercenaries in the restaurant were all outsiders. Many of them had some sort of backing behind them or were members of some mercenary groups. Although the Xianxia clan was the hegemon of Wake City, they didn't want to offend too many foreign powers. This was because some of these powers were so strong that even the Xianxia clan couldn't afford to offend them. Very soon, all the customers in the restaurant had left. Only a few waiters remained in the large restaurant, standing to the side in a daze. They were at a loss for what to do. The manager of the restaurant also stood to the side with a bitter expression. He stared at the empty restaurant in the blink of an eye. His face was filled with indescribable heartache. That was not a small amount of income. At this moment, in the entire restaurant, aside from the manager and the waiter, only Xianxia was still inside. Even the guests resting in the rooms upstairs were forced out by the waiter under the pressure of the Xianxia clan. Xianxia leisurely sat on a stool, looking at the group of people from the Xianxia clan who were still waiting outside with interest. Although on the surface, Xianxia didn't seem to care at all, he had long since become vigilant. After all, the people who had come this time didn't come with good intentions. Moreover, he had clearly sensed that there were quite a few powerful experts among the people who had come this time. At this moment, the young master of the Xianxia clan whom Xianxia had met in the forest outside the magical Beast Mountain range yesterday walked into the restaurant with large strides, like a moon surrounded by stars. As soon as he entered the restaurant, the young master of the Xianxia clan's gaze fell on Xianxia, who was sitting on a stool with a faint sneer on his face. A sinister glint flashed in his eyes. "Brat, you didn't think that you would have a day like this, did you? Yesterday, I let you bask in glory. Today, I'll make you pay with interest." The young master of the Xianxia clan stared at Xianxia with a cold smile. "How is it? Are you afraid? Do you regret it?" Following the young master's words, the group of people from the Xianxia clan standing behind him turned their sharp gazes one after another towards Xianxia. Xianxia disdainfully snorted. His gaze slowly swept over the group of people standing behind the young master of the Xianxia clan and said, "Don't tell me that you think you can scare me with just these few people? You're a bit too confident." The young master of the Xianxia clan coldly laughed. "You're even more arrogant than I thought. However, I can't help but admire your ability to talk big. At this moment, you actually didn't try to absolve yourself or kneel down and beg for forgiveness. Don't tell me that you think that in front of so many experts of the Xianxia clan, you still have a chance of escaping today? Moreover, this time, I brought no less than 100 people." The young master of the Xianxia clan was incomparably confident. From his point of view, it seemed that he had already eaten Xianxia today. Hearing these words, Xianxia's face couldn't help but reveal a trace of a smile. Right now, he suddenly felt that talking with this kind of hedonistic young master who hadn't seen the world was an extremely interesting thing. "Then do you believe that not only will I be able to leave today, But I'll also be able to make you suffer heavy casualties? Genshin's tone gradually became gloomy. Welcome to Immortal Cultivation Audiobooks, your gateway to the mystical world of Xianxia. Dive into legendary tales of martial arts, spiritual growth, and immortal ascension. Here, we bring you full-length English audiobooks of the best Wuxia and Xianxia stories, from young prodigies to ancient sect wars. Perfect for fans of Against the Gods, Martial World, and tales of demons and gods.